Hello everybody and welcome to this video where I'm going to analyse the poem Climbing My Grandfather by Andrew Waterhouse. Now, as always, we start off by looking at the poet themselves, so let's have a look at Andrew Waterhouse. He was born in Lincolnshire in 1958 and died in October 2001. He lived in Northumberland where he worked as a teacher and a freelance writer, but he won the Forward Prize for Best First Collection of Poetry in the year 2000, and from then on was a poet and musician. He died in October 2001, taking his own life. He actually committed suicide, which is very tragic. He suffered from depression throughout a lot of his life, and really sad ending to a very talented person's life. The themes of his poetry then, so there was one collection of poetry in 2000 and then a posthumous collection of poetry in 2002, but one of the themes, and this is from one of the critics who wrote about his first collection, is that he often writes about a world full of solid objects and hard edges, stones, wood, frozen ground, which offer little purchase to its inhabitants. And I thought that's quite fitting for the analysis of Climbing My Grandfather, which certainly does contain a world full of solid objects. Interestingly, Climbing My Grandfather is actually fairly simple to understand, and if you look at some of the other poetry from Andrew Waterhouse, it's very, very complex. So this is an interesting poem in that it stands out as being quite simple to understand, which certainly isn't in keeping with all of Andrew Waterhouse's poetry. But as I said, Climbing My Grandfather is one of the most simple poems in the anthology once you understand the metaphor which runs throughout it. You see, the speaker imagines himself climbing his grandfather, but his grandfather is a mountain, okay? So it sounds bizarre, doesn't it? But the poem contains an extended metaphor, a metaphor which runs throughout the poem, where the speaker is a climber and the grandfather is a mountain. So throughout the poem there are things we can interpret as being related to climbing, and then there are things we can interpret as being related to the relationship between the speaker and his grandfather. Once again, the cluster this poem appears in actually helps us. It's a love and relationships poem, so we don't want to write about this poem as if it's about mountain climbing. We want to look past the mountain imagery and see how it's used to tell us something about the relationship between the two people, the speaker and the grandfather. So the poem is a first-person exploration of an older family member, so it compares well with Follower and Mother Any Distance. Let's take a quick look at the poem, but as I said, as long as you can get your head around this metaphor that the mountain is the grandfather, it makes it a lot easier to understand. I decide to do it free without a rope or net. So the speaker is saying that I'm going to climb without any climbing equipment. First, the old brogue's dusty and cracked, an easy scramble onto his trousers, pushing into the weave, trying to get a grip. So the speaker starts at the bottom of the grandfather, his leather shoes, up his trousers. He's just climbing literally up the body of his grandfather. By the overhanging shirt I change direction, traverse along his belt to an earth-stained hand. So he's saying, I go past his shirt and then I change direction along the belt to his hand, which is stained by earth, as if he's been digging or doing some gardening or manual labour, that kind of thing. The nails are splintered and give good purchase. The skin of his finger is smooth and thick, like warm ice. So his nails are splintered, again a sign of probably manual labour, but the splinters in his nails give good grip, so it's easy to climb up them, and the skin on his finger is thick and smooth. On his arm I discover the glassy ridge of a scar, place my feet gently in the old stitches and move on. So what's being said here is that on his arm there's a scar, and I stand in that sort of on that scar to climb up. At his firm shoulder I rest for a while in the shade, not looking down, for climbing has its dangers. Then pull myself up the loose skin of his neck to a smiling mouth to drink among teeth. So it's this idea of I rest when I'm at the shoulder. I don't want to look down. Climbing is dangerous. And then I pull myself up on the skin of his neck and I look at his smile. Refreshed, I cross the screed cheek to stare into his brown eyes, watch a pupil slowly open and close. So I cross the loose, stone-covered cheek. I stare into his eyes. I watch his pupil open and close. First sign, by the way, that the grandfather is moving at all. Then up over the forehead. The wrinkles well spaced and easy, to his thick hair soft and white at this altitude, reaching for the summit, where gasping for breath I can only lie, watching clouds and birds circle, feeling his heat, knowing the slow pulse of his good heart. As with so many poems that we've studied, the last few lines get pretty deep. So what's he saying? I climb up over the forehead, over the wrinkles, his white hair, up to the top. And because I'm at the top of a mountain, the air is really thin and I can't breathe well. So I lie down and I watch nature. And I feel the heat of my grandfather. And I feel the beat of his heartbeat, his pulse. So it's quite a bizarre poem in many ways, but as I said, it helps us to focus our thinking on the relationship between the speaker and his grandfather. How does the speaker feel about his grandfather? And we're going to look at language and structure to explore that. Let's think firstly, though, about this extended metaphor of the mountain. What does that suggest? This is open to interpretation, of course, but if you were writing about your grandfather, what metaphor would you choose to use? Mountains have positive and negative attributes. They can be quite overwhelming, overpowering, intimidating, that sort of thing. But let's think a little bit about mountains. I think the qualities that are so important here that make the grandfather like a mountain are that they are steady, reliable, and admirable, all positive attributes. The sense of stability is what shines through for me. So the extended metaphor of the mountain is used to present the respect, even the awe that the speaker has for his grandfather. There are some less positive images, which we'll look at in this video, but the final words refer to the grandfather's good heart. And this is a structural choice. The poet choosing to end the poem this way is emphasizing the significance of this phrase. And choosing to end with this positive image reinforces the fact that this is a positive relationship. If we think about the structure of the poem, one thing that instantly jumps out as we look at it on the page is that it is made up of one long stanza. And we can ask ourselves, well, why is that? Now, with everything in this poem, there are two ways to look at it. How does it reflect the climb up the mountain, and how does it reflect the relationship with the grandfather? So we could say, well, the layout on the page, this one long stanza, relatively short lines, makes the poem look a bit like a mountain on the page. And that's fine, but there's more to it than that. We could say that the unbrokenness reflects the solidity and the stability of his grandfather. It reinforces the extended metaphor of his grandfather being a mountain. The speaker feels his grandfather is stable and reliable. We can also say that the poem is one continuous stanza, and that, coupled with the enjambment, where the sentences flow over onto the next lines, reflects the continuous action of the climb. There's no pause as you read the poem, or there's not much pausing, that would be suggested by, for example, stanza changes, and that reflects the continuous action of the climb. So you can see, even with a simple point like the one long stanza, we can analyse how that might have a literal interpretation about just climbing a mountain, but also what it tells us about the relationship. Now, interestingly, there's a lot of debate about whether this is thinking back to when he was a child, climbing all over his grandfather, or as an adult, is he thinking back about his grandfather, or is this happening now? There is the present tense in the opening. And I think that the lexical field of climbing suggests that this is an adult, intelligent speaker thinking about something about his grandfather. It's not something he did as a kid. So there's lots of words that are to do with climbing: rope, net, grip, overhanging, traverse, ridge, screed, altitude, summit. And some of those I had to look up myself. I didn't know that screed was a sort of mountain slope covered with loose stones. So the kind of sophistication of the vocabulary in the specialist field, the lexical field of climbing, to me suggests that this is the speaker now as an adult considering his grandfather, taking him in, weighing him up, and drawing conclusions. Now, we could ask ourselves, what is there to admire in the grandfather? And I think there's some interesting quotations when we look at that. So we've got the description of dusty and cracked, which describe the grandfather's shoes, earth-stained hand, nails are splintered, and on his arm a scar. So what impression do we get of the grandfather here? The earth-stained hand and the splintered nails in particular suggest that he's a hard-working manual worker. Have you ever heard the metaphor of dwarfs standing on the shoulders of giants? Have you ever heard people talk about, standing on the shoulders of giants? Well, it's a metaphor which expresses the meaning of discovering truth by building on previous discoveries. So you could say that the climbing of the grandfather literally has the speaker standing on the shoulders at one point, and it's possible the speaker is looking at his grandfather to discover truth from the previous discoveries his grandfather's made. And what are these? Well, we can only speculate, but perhaps the hard manual labour that is clearly evident here. He's looking back on this and he's looking at this aspect of his grandfather's life and thinking, that isn't something I want to do. It doesn't bring great reward. The dusty, cracked shoes and all the rest of it. It doesn't seem like, he's particularly in great shape. And this is very much similar to Heaney's Follower, which if you're studying for the AQA, that's one of the poems you can compare to. It's reminiscent of a speaker who looks at the way someone is doing something but chooses to do it a different way. Now that's speculation, but it's certainly based on textual evidence. The fact that the splintered nails give good purchase means that the brokenness of the nails actually makes them good to grip onto, and the metaphor there would suggest that the grandfather's hard experiences help the speaker make his own decisions. Whatever it is, we know the speaker learns something through the consideration of his grandfather. The poem begins with the word trying, but it ends with the much more definitive language of knowing, which emphasises how the speaker has gained knowledge from this climb, how he's changed throughout the poem. There's also another link with Follower, with the use of enjambment. If you remember in Follower, the sentence with a single pluck of reins, the sweating teen turned round and back into the land, is broken not only on different lines, but different stanzas, enjambment, as we often talk about in these videos. So the start of a new stanza in Follower comes just at the point when the father's turning the horses around to begin ploughing another line. So the turn between lines is both literal and metaphorical, and the speed between the turn reflects again the high level of skill the father possesses. Well, in climbing, as you see on the right side of the screen here, there's a similar use of enjambment in the line, by the overhanging shirt I change direction. The enjambment here, the moving on to another line, just like in Follower, reflects the change in direction. And here, though, we're not talking about the father's change or the grandfather's change in direction, but the speaker. But there's certainly a couple of interesting similarities with Follower, which make this probably my chosen poem to compare. The two work very well. Now, one of the most notable uses of language comes in the image of the grandfather's skin being smooth and thick, like warm ice. Now, this is a simile. So it's a simile, but it's also an oxymoron. It contradicts itself. Something can't be warm and ice at the same time. I would love you to put a comment in the comment section about what does this tell us. Now remember, we're thinking about the relationship between the speaker and the grandfather. I think it suggests something about the difference between how something looks and how it feels, how he might have had an idea about his grandfather, but in climbing him, in considering him closely, that actually changes. It looks like ice, but it's warm perhaps, and that could be the preconceived ideas about his grandfather and how they change. He's learning something during this process, but it really is ambiguous, and I certainly don't say that with sort of definitive conviction. So if you've got any ideas about that one, put them in the comment section. I just want to finish by looking at the end of the poem. This poem is often filled with complex words, but the final line is very simple. The slow pulse of his good heart. This is what we call monosyllabic. Each word is made up of only one syllable, and this slows down the pace as we're reading, which reflects the slow heartbeat of the grandfather. But also it's been a very quick pace throughout the poem, hasn't it? The one stanza, the enjambment, it reflects this continuous flow, the pace, the continuous climb, that sort of thing. So the slowing down of pace at the end of the poem suggests that the strenuous activity of climbing is finished. Whatever it is that the speaker has wanted to discover, it's now been discovered. Please do give this video a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel and watch my videos in the playlists. And of course there are the ebooks too at mrbrough.com and amazon.co.uk.